Amy and Ben were returning from their long-awaited vacation, which had given them a few days of peaceful happiness. It was already getting dark, and the night was descending on the highway like a thick, impenetrable veil. They were driving along a narrow road surrounded by ancient forests, and it seemed as though the trees were leaning over them, creating a natural tunnel. The headlights illuminated only a narrow strip of asphalt, which made the drive a bit nerve-wracking. "Are you okay?" Amy asked, noticing that Ben was gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. "Yeah, I just want to get home before midnight. This isn't the best place to stop," he replied, not taking his eyes off the road. A few minutes passed in silence, broken only by the steady hum of the engine. Suddenly, a light flickered ahead, as if someone far off had turned on powerful spotlights. "What's that?" Amy whispered, trying to make out the source of the light. "Maybe an accident?" Ben slowed down to avoid running into an unexpected obstacle. As they got closer, they saw several cars parked on the side of the road. People were standing off to the side, talking and showing something to each other. It looked strange, considering it was well past midnight. Ben slowed down and parked the car in a safe spot. "Do you think we should get out?" Amy looked at her husband with worry in her eyes. "Yeah, I'll see what's going on. Stay in the car." Ben got out and headed toward the group of people. Amy watched him through the window, feeling an uneasy sense of dread. She saw someone in the crowd hand Ben a photograph, and he froze, as if an icy touch had paralyzed his body. Ben turned toward the car with a pale face, and in his hands was an old photograph. Amy cracked the window, and he handed her the picture. In the photograph was their car with a license plate that perfectly matched their own. However, the picture looked old, as if it was at least 20 years old. All the cars in the photo were covered in dust, as if they had been abandoned for a long time. "Ben, what does this mean?" Amy's voice trembled. "This photo was taken in 2004. There was an accident here, and all the participants died. The car with this license plate, that's our car," Ben whispered. Amy stared at the photograph, unable to believe her eyes. Suddenly, the air around them grew heavier, and in the rearview mirror, she noticed a figure, a woman with a vacant stare and dark circles under her eyes, who seemed to be watching them. Ben quickly started the engine and slammed on the gas, leaving the group behind. But the fog began to thicken around them, and the car seemed to be caught in an endless night. Maria often came home late at night. Working as a nurse at the city hospital took a lot of energy, and her shifts often ended well after midnight. The road home was long and exhausting. Several kilometers of highway winding through forested hills sometimes seemed endless to her. That night it was pouring rain. The rain came down so hard that it felt as if the sky had cracked open, and water was rushing down in an unbroken flow. The wipers on the car worked at full speed, but still couldn't keep up. Maria gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to focus on the road, illuminated only by the dim light of the headlights. Suddenly, she noticed movement ahead. On the side of the road stood a woman, hunched over, wrapping her arms around herself, as if trying to protect herself from the biting cold. The woman looked as though she was in trouble. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, a long dress and shawl soaked through. Maria's heart tightened with compassion. She slowed down and rolled down the window. "Do you need help?" she shouted, trying to be heard over the sound of the rain. The woman lifted her head, and Maria felt a chill run through her body for a moment. Her eyes were empty and deep, like bottomless pits. But the moment passed, and the woman's expression turned normal, though still sad. She silently nodded. Maria pressed the button to unlock the rear door and gestured for the stranger to get inside. When the door closed, the car warmed slightly, although the cold from the wet clothing of the passenger immediately filled the space. Maria felt a strange tension, as if the air had become thick and heavy. "Do you live far from here?" she asked, trying to break the silence. There was no answer. In the rearview mirror, Maria saw the woman sitting with her head lowered, staring at the floor. Her wet hair clung to her cheeks, and her hands were still folded on her lap. Maria thought that she was probably just too cold or shocked. A few minutes passed in silence, broken only by the sound of the rain and the scraping of the wipers. But the farther they got from where she had picked up the woman, the stronger Maria felt that something was wrong. She glanced at the mirror again, and this time, her heart stopped. The back seat was empty. Maria slammed on the brakes, the car skidded, and she came to a stop on the side of the road. Breathing heavily, she turned around and looked at the back seat. It was indeed empty, and there were no wet traces left. Her mind tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe she was just too tired. Maybe it was a figment of her imagination. But the cold never left her, and something told her that this was not a dream. Later, she learned from the local news that many drivers on that stretch of road had seen the same woman. It was said that she was the ghost of a mother who had died in a car crash many years ago. She was still searching for her children, who had disappeared that fateful night. Route 66 is one of the most famous and mysterious roads in America. The stretch between two cities, winding and desolate, attracts not only tourists but also those who enjoy dark and eerie stories. Among truck drivers, there is a particular legend about a place known as the Devil's Horseshoe, which is not mentioned in guidebook. This bend in the highway is notorious not only for its danger but also for the strange occurrences that happen to those who dare to cross it at night. Dmitri, a young truck driver, had been driving for years, but with each new trip, he felt more and more as if the highway was changing his perception of reality. It all started one night shift when he was heading from California to Arizona, passing through the very Devil's Horseshoe. The evening rain left wet traces on his cabin windows, and he couldn't help but notice how dark clouds gathered on the horizon. As time passed, the road became more desolate and ominous. Dmitri noticed that there were almost no other vehicles on the road, which made him feel uneasy. Nonetheless, he continued, hoping to reach the nearest motel where he could get some rest. As he approached the famous turn, the night grew even foggier. A strange, sticky fog, denser than usual, hung over the road. That's when Dmitri noticed a silhouette by the roadside. Against the backdrop of dark trees and a gray sky stood the figure of a person. At first, he thought it was just a ghost, something common in such places. However, as he got closer, the shadow became clearer, and Dmitri realized the person was standing directly at the roadside, raising a hand as if signaling something. Instinctively, Dmitri slowed down, feeling a sense of unease. The silhouette looked strange. The man was dressed in dark clothing, and his face was hidden in the shadow of a hood. He stood still, as if waiting for something. Dmitri tried to pass by quickly, but didn't manage to. Just as he was almost at the turn, his gaze returned to the figure, and suddenly, for a moment, he was illuminated by a light, as if the headlights had revealed the man's face. Dmitri squinted, unable to look away from his gaze. Something was wrong with the man's eyes. It wasn't just a look, but something much more terrifying. The flash of light seemed unnatural, and in the next second, he noticed that the silhouette had vanished. It didn't disappear like a pedestrian would on an ordinary road. The figure vanished instantly, as if it dissolved into the air, as though it had never existed. In that moment, Dmitri felt cold sweat cover his body, and his heart raced. He was so scared that he barely managed to continue driving, his hands trembling. He accelerated, trying not to think about what had just happened. A few minutes later, he reached the nearest gas station, but his thoughts kept returning to the strange figure. The driver he spoke to at the station seemed completely calm, and even a little amused when Dmitri told him his story. He said there was nothing unusual about that place, and perhaps Dmitri had just been overworked or distracted. But Dmitri knew better. He wasn't the only one who had experienced such things. He had heard many similar stories from other drivers and, despite the skepticism of others, he was certain that something was wrong with the Devil's Horseshoe. There was something unexplained about this place, as if the road itself was connected to forces that could interfere with reality. A couple of weeks later, Dmitri went on another trip along the same route, hoping he wouldn't encounter that same feeling of fear again. He drove the same turns, past the same stretch of highway. But when he neared the dangerous bend once more, his heart tightened with fear. The strange sensation that the man was waiting for him again gripped him. He saw the silhouette again. He was standing by the roadside, raising his hand just like before. But this time, Dmitri knew he couldn't avoid the moment. He slammed on the brakes, pressing against the roadside, and didn't even consider driving past. His heart was pounding, and his whole body seemed frozen in fear. Soon, he saw the figure disappear. It simply dissolved, leaving no trace. From that moment on, Dmitri never drove that stretch of road at night again. And although other drivers kept going, none of them ever told stories like his. But for Dmitri, it was more than just a coincidence. He knew that those who passed the Devil's Horseshoe at night sometimes never returned home. Something happened to those who ended up on that stretch of road, and that experience stayed with him forever. Do you know what the old people in the area say? They claim that the turn in the highway was the site of a horrific incident many years ago. Not everyone knows about it, but on that night several people died there, and since then, strange things have been happening to those who end up on this section of road during the dark hours. They say the shadow at the turn is not just a person, but the soul of one of the victims, who cannot find peace and is trying to warn others of the impending danger. And if you don't listen, if you don't exercise caution, you'll become part of this story. Those who encountered the figure often disappeared without a trace, and no one could ever explain where they went. Dmitri, however, would forever be marked by the memory of that place and that turn. And although he tried to forget, one day he felt that perhaps not all the mysteries of the highway had been solved yet.